The river in early summer was unlike anything Mason Grant had seen in his 45 years. Swollen with snowmelt, it carved through the Texas borderlands with a fury that transformed the usually placid waterway into something vengeful. Standing on its bank, Mason watched the muddy current tear away at the soil, dragging whole branches and occasionally larger debris downstream in its relentless journey. He knew better than to cross here. Any man with sense would ride the extra 8 miles to Chapman's Ford, where the river widened and slowed. But Mason Grant had stopped measuring his choices against what sensible men would do long ago. The sorrel gelding beneath him pawed nervously at the ground, sensing its rider's intention before Mason had fully committed to it. The horse's ears flicked back and forth, its muscles tense beneath the worn saddle. "Easy," Mason murmured, running a calloused hand along the animal's neck. "We've crossed worse." He hadn't, not really, but the lie came easily. Lies always did these days. Mason adjusted the satchel strapped behind his saddle, feeling the weight of the medical supplies he'd ridden into town for that morning. Not that he practiced medicine anymore, not officially. But old habits died hard, and he couldn't bring himself to be without certain essentials even now, 12 years after he'd hung up his military surgeon's kit for good. The scar that ran from his right temple down to the corner of his mouth pulled tight as he squinted at the far bank. It was the souvenir of a Mexican saber, during the war a permanent reminder of his time as a battlefield doctor for the United States Army. The wound had healed poorly, leaving a jagged line that twisted his features into what some took for a perpetual sneer. It kept people at a distance, which suited Mason fine. Gathering the reins, he nudged the horse forward. The animal resisted, then reluctantly stepped into the rushing water. Mason felt the immediate pull of the current stronger than he'd anticipated. The horse struggled to find purchase on the slick riverbed, its breathing quickening to nervous snorts. "Steady," Mason commanded, his voice firm but even. "Straight across now." They were a third of the way across when Mason heard the sound, a deep subsonic rumble that seemed to vibrate through the water itself. Upstream, the river's surface changed, swelling visibly as a surge of water rushed toward them. Mason yanked hard on the reins, trying to turn back, but it was too late. The flash flood hit them broadside, a wall of water that knocked both horse and rider sideways. Mason felt himself torn from the saddle, plunged into cold darkness as the river claimed him. The current tumbled him violently, disorienting him completely. His lungs burned. His body slammed against submerged rocks. In desperate flashes of awareness, Mason's mind registered the absurdity of it all, that after surviving the bloody battlefields of the Mexican-American War, after enduring the loss of his wife and daughter to fever, he would die here in this nameless stretch of river on the edge of nowhere. His head broke the surface once, allowing him a single desperate gasp before the water pulled him under again. Images flashed before him, Clara's face pale with fever, her hand reaching for his. Little Sarah's golden curls spread across the pillow. The letter that had reached him too late at the field hospital, telling him to come home while there was still time. "I should have been there." The thought followed him into darkness as consciousness finally slipped away. Mason woke to the taste of earth and copper in his mouth. For a long, disorienting moment, he thought he was back in the field hospital in Veracruz, lying among the wounded and dying. But the air smelled different, not of gangrene and chloroform, but of smoke and herbs and rain. He tried to move and immediately regretted it. Pain lanced through his left side, sharp enough to steal his breath. His clothes had been removed, replaced by a rough blanket that scratched against his skin. "Don't move." The voice came from somewhere to his right, low, female, and authoritative. Mason turned his head slowly, wincing as the movement sent fresh waves of pain through his skull. She sat cross-legged near a small fire, grinding something in a stone mortar. Her long black hair was tied back with a strip of leather, revealing high cheekbones, and eyes so dark they seemed to absorb the firelight rather than reflect it. She wore a simple deerskin dress adorned with modest beadwork at the collar, practical rather than decorative. Apache. The recognition was immediate and visceral, triggering memories Mason had tried to bury. 1 week earlier, he'd stood on a ridge overlooking Crow Creek, watching as William Blackwood's militia descended on an Apache encampment. Mason had ridden with them that far, having been told they were tracking cattle rustlers. By the time he realized Blackwood's true intent, the attack had already begun. He'd seen her then, this same woman running toward the river with a group of children urging them ahead of her as Blackwood's men closed in. Mason had watched frozen on his horse as one by one the children were cut down. The woman had been struck by a bullet stumbling at the riverbank before plunging into the water as the militia closed in. He had done nothing, had simply turned his horse and ridden away, telling himself it wasn't his fight, wasn't his responsibility. And now, here she was, tending to him in what appeared to be a shallow cave. A sick irony that made his stomach twist. "Where am I?" He managed his voice a cracked whisper. "Safe," she replied, without looking up from her work. "For now." Mason tried to sit up again, grimacing through the pain. This time he succeeded, propping himself against the cave wall. The blanket fell to his waist, revealing deep bruising across his ribs. "My horse, gone." She set down the mortar and stood moving toward him with a small clay cup. "Drink." Mason hesitated, eyeing the dark liquid suspiciously. Something like amusement flickered across her face. "If I wanted you dead, I would have left you in the river." A fair point. Mason took the cup and sniffed the contents, a bitter herbal concoction that made his nose wrinkle. At her expectant look, he drank it down, fighting the urge to gag. "It will help with the pain," she said, taking the empty cup. "And the fever that's coming." Mason frowned. "I don't have a fever." "You will." She returned to her place by the fire. "Your body was in the river too long. The sickness always follows." Outside, rain began to fall, pattering against the ground beyond the cave entrance. In the dim light, Mason studied his surroundings more carefully. The cave was small, but well organized. Dried herbs hung from the low ceiling in neat bundles. Various containers, some clay, some woven, some made from hollowed gourds, were arranged along one wall. A bed of furs and blankets lay opposite his own makeshift pallet. This was no temporary shelter. She had been living here. "You're the woman from Crow Creek," he said finally, watching her face carefully for reaction. "The one who jumped into the river." She went very still, her hands pausing in their work. "And you're the man who watched from the ridge." The accusation hung in the air between them, sharp as a blade. Mason didn't deny it. "Why did you save me?" he asked instead. She resumed grinding the stone pestle, moving in rhythmic circles. "I ask myself the same question." Thunder rumbled outside, closer now. The rain intensified, creating a curtain of water across the cave entrance. Mason's head throbbed, and the bitter medicine was already making him drowsy. "What's your name?" he asked, struggling to keep his eyes open. For a long moment, she didn't answer, and he thought she might ignore the question entirely. Then, softly, "Aita." "Aita." He repeated the name, unfamiliar on his tongue. "I'm Mason, Mason Grant." "I know who you are, Mason Grant." Her voice had a strange quality to it now, almost as if she were speaking from a great distance. "The river has been waiting for you." Before he could ask what she meant, darkness claimed him once more. Mason's fever dreams were vivid and terrifying. He was back on the battlefield, trying desperately to save a young soldier whose face kept changing, first a stranger, then Blackwood, then himself. Blood poured endlessly from wounds he couldn't close. Clara stood watching, holding Sarah's hand, both of them pale and ghostly. "You weren't there," Clara said, her voice hollow. "You should have been there." "I'm sorry," Mason tried to say, but no sound came out. The scene shifted. He was standing on the banks of a river, but not the one that had nearly claimed his life. This river was black as ink, its surface unnaturally still. On the opposite shore, Clara and Sarah waited, their figures indistinct in a strange mist. "Cross over," Clara called, her voice echoing oddly. "Come home." Mason stepped into the water, but instead of sinking, he found himself walking on the surface. With each step, ripples spread outward, disturbing the perfect blackness. He was halfway across when hands reached up from below, grasping at his ankles, trying to pull him under. He looked down and saw faces in the water, dozens of them, men and women and children, their eyes wide with accusation. Among them were the Apache children from Crow Creek, their small hands reaching for him. Mason woke with a gasp, his body drenched in sweat. The cave was dark except for the low glow of embers in the fire pit. Rain still fell outside, gentler now. How long had he been unconscious? 3 days. Mason startled at the voice. Aida sat nearby, watching him with those unreadable dark eyes. Had he spoken aloud? "The fever was strong," she continued. "I thought it might take you." Mason swallowed, his throat painfully dry. As if reading his mind, Aida handed him a water skin. He drank deeply the cool liquid, a blessed relief. "You talk in your sleep," she said when he'd finished. "You call for Clara, for Sarah." Mason went still. "My wife and daughter, they're gone." "I know." Aida's gaze was steady, unsettling in its directness. "The river showed me." "What does that mean?" Mason demanded, unnerved by her strange talk. Instead of answering, Aida rose and moved to the cave entrance, looking out at the rain-soaked landscape. Her silhouette was stark against the gray light of dawn. "My people believe the river that runs through this valley is not like other rivers," she said finally. "It flows between worlds, the world of the living and the world of the spirits." Mason exhaled slowly. "With respect, I don't put much stock in such things." "And yet, here you are." She turned to face him. "Pulled from its waters when you should have died, nursed back to health by someone who has every reason to let you die." There was no arguing with that logic, peculiar as it was. Mason shifted, uncomfortably wincing, as his bruised ribs protested. "Why didn't you?" he asked. "Let me die, I mean." Aida was silent for a long moment. "Because the river didn't want you yet." She moved back to the fire, adding small sticks to rebuild the flames. "And because I have questions that only you can answer." "About what happened at Crow Creek," Mason guessed. She nodded once. "About the man who led them, the one they call Blackwood." Mason's expression darkened. "William Blackwood, a cattle baron with political ambitions and a deep hatred for your people. Why, he lost his son in a raid 2 years ago. At least, that's what he claims. Some say the boy simply ran off, tired of his father's cruelty." Mason rubbed his temple where a headache was beginning to form. "Blackwood blames all Apache for what happened, regardless of band or clan." Aida absorbed this information in silence, her face revealing nothing. "And you, why were you with them that day?" The question cut to the heart of what Mason had been avoiding. I wasn't. I didn't know what Blackwood planned. He said they were tracking rustlers who'd taken cattle from his north pasture. And when you discovered his lie, when you saw what was happening, her voice remained level, but her eyes bore into him with an intensity that made him look away. I did nothing. Mason admitted, the words bitter on his tongue. I watched, and then I rode away. The confession hung in the air between them, stark and damning. Mason waited for her anger, her condemnation. Instead, Aita merely nodded, as if he'd confirmed something she already knew. The men who attacked us, she said after a long silence. They will come back, won't they? Yes, Mason answered truthfully. Blackwood is thorough. He'll want to be certain no one survived to tell what happened. Then we have little time. Aida stood gathering a small bundle of herbs from where they hung drying. You need to regain your strength. There's meat drying outside. I'll bring some in. She moved toward the cave entrance, but paused when Mason called after her. Aida. He struggled to find the right words. I'm sorry. For what happened to your people. For not trying to stop it. She looked back at him, her expression unreadable. Words are easy, Mason Grant. We will see what your actions say. With that, she disappeared into the misty morning, leaving Mason alone with his thoughts and the lingering echoes of his fever dreams. Over the next several days, Mason's strength gradually returned. Under Aita's care, his fever broke completely, and the pain in his ribs subsided to a dull ache. She fed him a diet of lean game meat, wild roots, and berries, preparing infusions of herbs that tasted foul but seemed to speed his recovery. They settled into an uneasy coexistence. Aita went about her daily tasks, tending to her small garden hidden among the rocks, checking snares, gathering wood, while Mason slowly began to assist with what his recovering body would allow. At first, she seemed surprised by his willingness to help, watching with suspicious eyes as he mended a torn snare or arranged firewood to dry. On the fourth day after his fever broke, Mason ventured outside the cave for the first time. The landscape was both familiar and foreign, rolling hills covered in scrub oak and mesquite, split by the river that had nearly claimed his life. The cave was set high on a rocky slope, well hidden from casual observation, but with a clear view of the surrounding territory. Your home is well positioned, he remarked to Aita, who was skinning a rabbit nearby. Defensive. It needed to be. She worked with practiced efficiency, her hands sure and steady. After the attack, I knew they would come looking for survivors. Mason sat on a flat rock watching her work. You've been here since Crow Creek all alone. Aita nodded once, not looking up. 3 months. The implications of that struck Mason hard. 3 months of solitude, of vigilance, of surviving with the knowledge that everyone she knew had been slaughtered. He tried to imagine the toll such isolation would take, and found himself wondering at the reserves of strength it required. Were there others with you when you escaped? Her hands stilled momentarily. No, I was the only one who reached the river. A pause. I was carrying my sister's child when the attack came. I lost it in the river. The simple statement, delivered without self-pity, hit Mason with the force of a physical blow. He had seen so much death in his years, as a military surgeon had become almost numb to its endless variations. But this, a woman losing her unborn child while fleeing for her life, struck him as a particular cruelty. I'm sorry, he said inadequately. Aita resumed her work. My people have a saying, grief is the shadow that follows joy. Without one, we would not recognize the other. They fell into silence after that, the only sounds the soft scrape of Aita's knife against hide and the distant murmur of the river below. Mason found himself studying her more openly than he had before. There was a contained quality to her movements, a deliberate precision that spoke of someone who had learned to conserve energy, to waste nothing. Her face, when not deliberately blank, conveyed a depth of thought that intrigued him. "You were a healer," she said, suddenly breaking the silence. "Among your people." Mason blinked in surprise. "How did you know that?" "Your hands," she gestured with her knife. "They move differently than a farmer's or a rancher's, more precise. And you recognized the herbs I was using for your fever." "I was a surgeon," he confirmed, "in the war with Mexico, and for some years after." "Why did you stop?" The question was direct without judgment. Still, Mason found himself reluctant to answer. "My wife and daughter fell ill while I was away," he said, finally, the words coming out flat, rehearsed from too many tellings. "Typhoid fever. By the time I received word and returned home, it was too late." "And you blame yourself." "It wasn't a question. I was saving strangers while my own family died." Mason's voice hardened. "Yes, I blame myself." Aita tied off the skin she'd been working on and set it aside. "Among my people, healers are chosen by the spirits. It is not a path one can simply abandon because of pain or loss." Mason felt a flare of anger. "Your people aren't mine." "No," she agreed easily. "But the river doesn't care about such distinctions. It brought you here for a reason." Again, with the river talk, Mason suppressed his irritation. "The river nearly killed me. If not for you, it would have succeeded." "Perhaps." Aida stood gathering the meat she'd prepared. "Or perhaps it was returning you to where you're meant to be." Before Mason could respond, she turned and walked back toward the cave, leaving him with an unsettled feeling that had nothing to do with his physical injuries. That night, Mason dreamed of the river again. This time he stood on the bank watching as Aita waded into the dark water. She turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting starlight. "There are worse things than dying, Mason Grant," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the water. "Living without purpose is one of them." She submerged slowly, disappearing beneath the surface without struggle. Mason tried to follow to pull her back, but his feet seemed rooted to the shore. The water began to rise, flowing up over the bank, reaching for him with inexorable patience. As it touched his feet, he heard Clara's voice, as clear as if she stood beside him. "She needs you, Mason, as I once did." He woke with a start, his heart racing. The cave was dark, except for the faint glow of embers. Across the fire pit, Aita slept soundly, her breathing deep and regular. Outside, an owl called its cry echoing through the night. Mason lay back, staring at the low ceiling of the cave. It had been years since he'd dreamed of Clara with such vivid clarity. Years since he'd felt her presence so keenly. He told himself it was just the lingering effects of the fever, the strange isolation of this place, the unsettling talk of rivers and spirits. But deep down in a place he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge, he wondered if there might be something more to it, something he couldn't explain with his surgeon's training or his white man's skepticism. Sleep eluded him for the remainder of the night. The following morning, Mason ventured farther from the cave than he had previously, exploring the rocky terrain that surrounded their shelter. His body was nearly recovered now, his movements more sure, though his ribs still ached when he breathed deeply. He followed a narrow path that wound down toward the river, moving cautiously through the scrub oak and mesquite that provided cover. Birds called warnings at his approach, their alarm serving as a reminder that in this landscape, surprise was a luxury he couldn't afford. The river came into view as he rounded a limestone outcropping. From this vantage point, it looked deceptively peaceful, its surface glinting in the morning sun. Hard to believe that just a week ago, It had nearly claimed his life. "The river has been waiting for you." Aita's words returned to him unbidden. Mason shook his head, trying to dispel the lingering unease they provoked. He was a man of science, of rational thought. He had seen too much death to believe in mystical forces or spiritual interventions, and yet standing here, watching the river flow relentlessly toward some distant goal, he couldn't entirely dismiss the feeling that there was something different about this place, something that defied his usual categories of understanding. The snap of a twig behind him brought Mason's thoughts back to the present with jarring suddenness. He turned, reaching instinctively for a weapon he no longer carried. Aita stood a few paces away, watching him with those steady, dark eyes. She held a small woven basket filled with what looked like wild onions and other foraged plants. "You shouldn't wander so far," she said, her voice carrying a note of concern rather than accusation. "Your tracks are easy to follow." Mason glanced down at his boots, suddenly aware of the clear trail he'd left in the soft earth. "I needed to see it again," he admitted. "The river." Something like understanding crossed Aita's face. "It calls to some people that way, especially those it has touched." "You talk about it as if it's alive," Mason observed, keeping his tone neutral. "Isn't it?" Aita moved to stand beside him, looking out over the water. "It breathes, it moves, it takes, and it gives. What would you call that, if not life?" Mason had no ready answer. Instead, he changed the subject. "How much longer do you think we have before Blackwood's men return to this area?" Aita's expression sobered. "Not long. The moon will be full in 3 nights. They will come before then." "How can you be sure?" She gave him a look that managed to be both patient and challenging. "The same way I knew you would come to the river that day. The same way I knew you would need saving." A chill ran down Mason's spine despite the warm morning air. "You're saying you foresaw it?" "The women in my family have always had dreams that show what is to come," Aita said matter-of-factly. "Not everything, not always clearly, but enough." Mason studied her face, looking for signs of deception or delusion. He found neither, only a calm certainty that was somehow more unsettling than any lie would have been. "And what do these dreams tell you about Blackwood?" he asked carefully. "That he won't stop until he finds me." Her gaze returned to the river. "And that you will have to choose a side when he does." The statement hung between them, weighted with implication. Mason felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same feeling he'd experienced on the ridge above Crow Creek, watching the massacre unfold. The paralysis of indecision, of knowing what was right, but lacking the courage to act on it. "I should return to my ranch," he said abruptly. "I can bring back supplies, weapons, maybe arrange for you to reach the reservation at Fort Sill." Aita shook her head. "The reservation is not an option for me. It would be safer than staying here alone." "Would it?" Her voice took on an edge. "Tell me, Mason Grant, have you seen the reservations? Have you seen what becomes of my people there?" He hadn't, not personally, though. He'd heard stories: overcrowding, disease, starvation, the slow death of a people and their way of life. "Then what do you suggest?" he asked, frustration coloring his tone. "You can't stay here forever, living in a cave, always looking over your shoulder." "No," she agreed quietly. "I can't." Something in her voice made Mason look at her sharply. "What aren't you telling me?" Aita met his gaze steadily. "There are other places, other people, but I cannot reach them alone, not with Blackwood hunting me." "You're asking for my help." "I'm offering you a chance," she corrected, "to make a different choice than you did at Crow Creek." The words struck Mason like a physical blow. He turned away, unable to face the truth in her eyes. Below them, the river continued its ceaseless journey, indifferent to the human drama playing out on its banks. "I need to think," he said finally. Aita nodded once. "Think quickly, Mason Grant. Time is not our friend." She left him there, returning to the cave with her gathered plants. Mason remained by the river for a long while, wrestling with choices he had hoped never to face again. Mason was awakened that night by Aita's hand on his shoulder, her touch urgent but gentle. He came to consciousness instantly, a habit formed during years of battlefield medicine. "Someone's coming," she whispered, her face close to his in the darkness. "Many men on horseback." Mason listened and heard it too, the distant but unmistakable sound of horses moving through brush, the occasional clink of metal against metal. His stomach tightened with dread. "Blackwood?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Aita nodded, her eyes reflecting the faint moonlight that filtered into the cave. "They're following the river, searching." Mason rose quickly, pulling on his boots. His mind raced through options, none of them good. The cave was well hidden, but not invisible to a thorough search. And if Blackwood had brought trackers, as he surely had— "We need to move," he said decisively. "Now." Aita was already gathering essential supplies, her knife a small bundle of dried meat, a water skin. She worked with calm efficiency, as if she had prepared for this moment many times in her mind. Mason helped as best he could, stuffing medicinal herbs into a small pouch, securing the water skins. Within minutes, they were ready to depart. "Where?" Aita asked simply, standing at the cave entrance. Mason thought quickly. The approaching riders were coming from the south, following the river upstream. To the north lay his own ranch, but that was too obvious a destination. East would take them into more open country, where they'd be easily spotted. West, he decided, into the hills. There are caves, old mine shafts, places to hide while we figure out a longer-term plan. Aita nodded her agreement, and they slipped out into the night. The waxing moon cast enough light to see by, but also enough to be seen. They moved carefully, using the scrub oak and limestone outcroppings for cover. Mason led the way, drawing on his knowledge of the territory, while Aita followed with a silent grace that made him acutely aware of his own comparative clumsiness. They had covered perhaps half a mile when the sound of horses grew suddenly louder. Mason froze, pulling Aita down behind a large boulder. Moments later, riders appeared on the ridge above them, 5 or 6 men, their silhouettes dark against the night sky. "Spread out," a voice commanded, one Mason recognized with a chill. "William Blackwood. Check every cave, every hollow. I want that squaw found by sunrise." The men dispersed, moving down the slope in different directions. One rider headed directly toward their hiding place. Mason glanced at Aita, saw the tight control in her expression. She held her knife ready, though both knew it would be little use against men with rifles. The rider drew closer, his horse picking its way carefully down the rocky incline. In the moonlight, Mason could make out his features now, a young man barely out of his teens, with a nervous set to his shoulders. One of Blackwood's newer recruits, perhaps. Mason made a split-second decision. Pressing Aita's shoulder in a silent command to stay hidden, he stepped out from behind the boulder. "Evening," he called softly, raising his hands to show they were empty. The young rider jerked in surprise, nearly losing his seat. His hand went to his rifle but hesitated when he recognized Mason. "Dr. Grant," he said uncertainly, "what are you doing out here?" Mason forced a casual shrug. "Got caught in that storm last week. Lost my horse crossing the river. Been making my way back on foot." The lie came smoothly believable in its simplicity. "What brings Blackwood's men out this way?" The young man glanced around nervously. "Mr. Blackwood's looking for an Apache woman, survivor from that raid at Crow Creek. Says she's dangerous." "Oh, does he now?" Mason kept his tone conversational while his mind raced. "Well, I haven't seen anyone out here. Just coyotes and rattlers." "You should come with me," the rider said, his confidence returning. "Mr. Blackwood will want to know you're alive. Everyone thought you'd drowned in the river." It was the opening Mason needed. "Lead the way," he agreed. "My legs could use a rest." The young man turned his horse, and in that moment of inattention, Mason moved. He grabbed the rider's arm, yanking him from the saddle with a force born of desperation. They fell together, Mason using his weight to drive the younger man into the ground. The rider fought back with surprising strength, landing a solid blow to Mason's still tender ribs. Pain flared white-hot, but Mason held on, managing to pin the man beneath him. "I'm sorry about this," he muttered, and struck the rider's temple with a precise blow that rendered him unconscious. Mason rolled off him, breathing hard. Aida appeared at his side, her expression unreadable in the moonlight. "You could have killed him," she observed. "He's just a boy," Mason replied, checking the rider's pulse to confirm it was strong and steady. "Following orders he doesn't understand." Aida's gaze was evaluating, measuring him against some internal standard he couldn't discern. Finally, she nodded once, accepting his choice. "The horse," she said, moving toward where the animal stood nervously nearby. "We can use it." Mason secured the unconscious rider with strips torn from his own shirt, gagging him to prevent any immediate alarm when he woke. By the time they'd finished, the voices of the other searchers had grown more distant, moving away from their position. "They'll find him eventually," Mason warned as he helped Aida onto the horse. "We need to put as much distance as possible between us and them before that happens." He swung up behind her, taking the reins. The horse, a sturdy bay, shifted beneath their combined weight, but held steady. "West." Aida confirmed, her body tense against his. Mason nodded, turning the horse toward the distant hills. As they rode away from the river, he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed, that in choosing to protect Aida, he had crossed a line from which there would be no easy return. What surprised him most was how little regret he felt about it. Dawn was breaking by the time they reached the foothills, the eastern sky blushing pink and gold. They had pushed the horse as hard as they dared through the night, following game trails and dry creek beds to minimize their tracks. Now, with daylight exposing them, they needed to find shelter. "There's an old silver mine about 2 miles ahead," Mason said, his voice rough with fatigue. "Abandoned years ago. We can rest there." Aida nodded, her back still straight, despite the hours of hard riding. She had remained largely silent throughout their journey, conserving energy, watching the landscape with the keen eyes of someone whose survival depended on missing nothing. They reached the mine as the sun cleared the horizon. It was little more than a dark opening in the side of a hill, partially obscured by scrub growth that had reclaimed the area since the miners departed. Mason dismounted stiffly, his body protesting the long ride after days of relative inactivity. He helped Aida down, noting how she winced slightly as her feet touched the ground. For all her stoicism, she was exhausted too. "Stay here with the horse," he instructed. "I'll check inside." The mine entrance was smaller than he remembered, requiring him to duck as he entered. The air inside was cool and damp, carrying the mineral scent of earth long hidden from the sun. Mason struck a match, illuminating rough-hewn walls and a floor littered with debris from the mining operation. The tunnel extended perhaps 30 feet before ending in a chamber where the silver vein had been extracted. It wasn't comfortable, but it would serve as temporary shelter. He returned to find Aita unsaddling the horse, her movements practiced, despite her evident fatigue. "It's safe," he reported. "Not comfortable, but dry and defensible." Together, they led the horse inside, securing it in the main chamber, where there was room for it to lie down. Mason spread the saddle blanket on the ground, creating a makeshift seat for Aita. "Rest," he urged. "I'll keep watch." She sank down gratefully, though her eyes remained alert. "They will track us here eventually." "Yes," Mason agreed, too tired for false reassurances. "But not immediately. The boy I knocked out won't be found for hours yet. And even then, they'll have to pick up our trail from where we left him. Blackwood won't give up." "No." Mason settled himself near the mine entrance where he could see out, while remaining hidden in shadow. "But neither will we." Aita studied him for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. "You made your choice, then." It wasn't really a question, but Mason answered anyway. "I made it the moment I stepped out from behind that rock." She nodded slowly, something like respect flickering in her dark eyes. "Thank you." The simple words carried a weight that Mason felt in his chest, a warmth that spread through him like good whiskey. He nodded in acknowledgement, not trusting himself to speak. Aita leaned back against the rough wall, her eyes drifting closed, despite her evident desire to remain vigilant. Within minutes, her breathing deepened into sleep. Mason watched her for a while, struck by the contradiction she embodied, the fierce strength alongside the vulnerability, the caution alongside the trust she had placed in him. He wondered what her life had been before Crow Creek, what dreams and hopes had been shattered by Blackwood's men. Outside, the sun climbed higher, casting harsh light across the scrubland. Mason's thoughts drifted to his ranch, abandoned now for over a week. Would his nearest neighbor, old Jim Parsons, notice his absence? Would anyone come looking for him, or would the place simply stand empty, gradually reclaimed by the land as the mine had been? Strangely, the thought didn't trouble him as it once might have. The ranch had never been a home, not really just a place to exist, to lose himself in mindless work while the years slipped away. A penance, perhaps, for not being there when Clara and Sarah needed him. "She needs you, Mason." "As I once did." The memory of Clara's voice from his dream returned with startling clarity. Mason glanced at Aita's sleeping form, wondering if there was truth in the dream words. Did she need him, or was he simply projecting his own need for purpose onto her situation? The questions circled in his mind, finding no resolution. Eventually, fatigue overcame even his restless thoughts, and he drifted into an uneasy sleep. His back against the cool stone of the mine entrance, his face turned toward the woman who had saved him from the river. Outside, a raven called 3 times, its harsh cry echoing across the silent hills. Then it took flight, a black shadow against the endless blue of the Texas sky, leaving no trace of its passing. The mine provided shelter through the heat of the day. Mason dozed fitfully at the entrance, waking at every sound, the scurry of a lizard across stone, the distant cry of a hawk, the shifting of the horse in the darkness behind him. Each time his hand went instinctively to the knife he'd taken from the young rider's belt, his body tensing for a fight that didn't come. By late afternoon, the worst of the day's heat had passed. Mason ventured outside, careful to stay within the shadow of the hillside. The landscape stretched empty in all directions, the rolling terrain broken only by scrub oak and mesquite. No sign of pursuit, not yet. When he returned to the mine, he found Aita awake, methodically sorting through their meager supplies. She looked up as he entered, her dark eyes assessing. "No one's coming," he reported, settling across from her. "Not yet, anyway." She nodded once. "They will search the river first. The hills will come later. Which gives us time to plan our next move." Mason took a drink from one of the water skins, then passed it to her. "Where were you thinking of going? You mentioned other people." Aita drank sparingly before answering. "There is a band of Mescalero Apache living in the mountains to the west. They have resisted the reservations. My mother's sister married into their band many years ago." "The Sierra Blanca." Mason frowned. "That's Apache territory, true enough, but it's also almost 200 miles from here." "I know the way," she said simply. Mason rubbed his jaw, feeling the rough stubble that had accumulated over the past week. "It's a hard journey, dangerous country, little water, lots of hostiles, both white and Indian." "I didn't say it would be easy." A hint of impatience colored her voice. "Only that it's possible. And if we make it, what then?" Aita's gaze turned inward, as if seeing something beyond the confines of the mine. "Then I rejoin my people. Live as we were meant to live, not penned like animals on a reservation." There was a fierce pride in her words that Mason couldn't help but admire, even as he recognized the improbability of her hopes. The days of free-roaming Apache bands were numbered, if not already past. The army, the settlers, the railroads, all were closing in, squeezing the native peoples into ever smaller pockets of resistance. But he didn't voice these thoughts. Who was he to crush what little hope she had left? "And what about you, Mason Grant?" Aita asked, interrupting his thoughts. "What becomes of you if we reach the Sierra Blanca?" It was a question he hadn't allowed himself to consider. "I suppose I turn back, return to my ranch." "As if nothing happened." Her expression was skeptical. "Blackwood will know by now that you helped me escape. He will not forget such a betrayal." She was right, of course. In choosing to help Aita, he had made an enemy of one of the most powerful men in the territory. There would be no returning to his old life, not without consequences. "I'll cross that bridge when I come to it," he said finally. "For now, let's focus on keeping you alive and getting you to your people." Aita studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his words against some internal measure. Then she nodded once, accepting his evasion without pressing further. "We should move at dusk," she said. "Travel by night when it's cooler." "Agreed." Mason moved to check on the horse, running his hands along its flanks. The animal seemed recovered from their hard ride, though it would need water soon. "There's a spring about 3 miles west of here. We can water the horse there, then follow the foothills north before turning west." As he spoke, a wave of dizziness washed over him. He steadied himself against the mine wall, hoping Aita hadn't noticed. The past week, the near drowning, the fever, the escape from Blackwood's men had taken more out of him than he wanted to admit. But Aita's sharp eyes missed nothing. "You're not fully recovered," she observed. "The river sickness still lingers." "I'm fine," Mason insisted, straightening. "Just hungry." She reached into her small pack and withdrew a strip of dried meat, offering it wordlessly. Mason took it with a nod of thanks, chewing the tough, gamey flesh, while trying to ignore the persistent ache in his side. He couldn't afford weakness now, not with both their lives depending on his strength. "Tell me about the river sickness," he said, partly to distract himself, partly out of genuine curiosity. "You spoke as if it's something specific, something you've seen before." Aita settled back against the rough wall of the mine, her expression thoughtful. "My people believe that each river has its own spirit. Some are gentle, nurturing. Others are hungry, demanding sacrifice. The one that flows through this valley is of the second kind. And this spirit causes illness in those who survive its waters. Not illness exactly." She chose her words carefully. "More like a claiming. The river touches something deep inside, leaves a mark that never fully fades." Mason thought of his dreams, the black river, Clara's voice, the hands reaching up from the depths. A chill ran through him despite the lingering heat of the day. "You talk as if you've experienced this yourself," he observed. "I have." Aita's gaze grew distant. "When I fled from Blackwood's men, the river took me under. I should have died that day. Instead, I woke on the far bank with no memory of how I got there. And afterward, the dreams." She looked at him sharply. "Yes, dreams of those I had lost. Dreams of what was to come." "Like me," Mason said quietly. "You dreamed of me before we met." Aita nodded. "I saw you standing on the ridge at Crow Creek. I saw you crossing the river. I saw myself pulling you from the water." Why? The question that had plagued him since waking in her care. "Why save me when you knew I had watched your people die?" "Because the river showed me more than just that moment," she replied. "It showed me who you were before. A healer. A man who had lost his way." Mason looked away, uncomfortable with her perception. "And that was reason enough to risk your life for mine. The women in my family have always been dreamers," Aita said, instead of answering directly. "My grandmother, my mother, my sister, we see things others cannot. Sometimes these visions guide us to where we need to be, to what we need to do." "And what did these visions tell you to do with me?" Mason asked, not entirely sure he wanted to hear the answer. Aita met his gaze steadily. "They showed me that our paths are joined, Mason Grant. For good or ill, the river has bound us together." The certainty in her voice unsettled him. Mason had spent years dismissing such talk, the superstitions of natives, the religious fervor of frontier preachers, all manner of beliefs that couldn't be verified by observation or reason. His medical training had taught him to trust only what could be measured, categorized, understood through scientific principles. And yet, sitting here in the dim light of an abandoned mine, facing a woman who had known to wait by the river on the exact day he would need saving, he found his certainty wavering. "I don't believe in fate," he said finally. "What you believe doesn't matter," Aita replied without heat or judgment. "The river believes in you." They set out at dusk, as planned, riding double on the stolen horse. Mason led, guiding them away from the established trails, keeping to the shadows of hills and arroyos, where their silhouette would be less visible against the darkening sky. Aita sat behind him, her body warm against his back, her arms loose around his waist. She rode well, moving with the horse rather than against it, maintaining her balance, even when the terrain grew challenging. It was one of many small skills he'd observed in her, the product of a life lived close to the land, dependent on practical knowledge rather than luxury or convenience. They reached the spring shortly after full dark, a small but reliable source of water hidden in a fold of the hills. Mason dismounted stiffly, helping Aita down before leading the horse to drink. "We'll rest here an hour," he decided, "then push on until dawn." Aita nodded agreement, kneeling beside the spring to fill their water skins. In the faint moonlight, her profile was sharply defined, high cheekbones, straight nose, the clean line of her jaw. There was a quiet dignity in her bearing that impressed Mason, especially given all she had endured. "You said your sister was expecting a child," he said, the words emerging before he'd fully considered them. "The one you were carrying when—" "Yes." Aita secured the cap on the water skin. "My sister and her husband were killed in the first moments of the attack. I grabbed the children, her son and daughter, and ran for the river." Her voice remained steady, but Mason saw the tension in her shoulders. "The boy was shot before we reached the water. The girl, she fell in the river. I couldn't hold on to her." Mason's chest tightened at the simple recounting of such tragedy. "I'm sorry," he said inadequately. Aita stood, her expression hidden by shadow. My people have a saying, the dead are never truly gone until the last person who remembers them has joined them. She touched her abdomen briefly. I remember. For all of them. They fell silent after that, each lost in private thoughts, as they prepared to continue their journey. Mason checked the horse's hooves for stones, adjusted the makeshift saddle, and verified that their few supplies were securely fastened. Aita moved around the perimeter of the spring, gathering some small plants that Mason couldn't identify in the darkness. When they mounted again, Mason felt a subtle shift in their dynamic. Aita's arms wrapped more securely around his waist, her body leaning into his back, with a trust that hadn't been there before. It was a small thing, but significant, an acknowledgement of their shared purpose, their mutual dependence. They rode through the night following the stars and Mason's imperfect memory of the territory. The land changed gradually as they moved west, the scrub giving way to more substantial stands of juniper and piñon pine, the terrain becoming more rugged. As dawn approached, Mason began looking for a suitable place to shelter during the coming day. They needed somewhere defensible with shade, and ideally, a view of the surrounding area. He found it just as the eastern sky began to lighten, a rock formation that created a natural overhang partially screened by juniper, with a small flat area beneath where they could rest. From this vantage point, they could see several miles back along their trail. "This will do," he announced, reining in the horse. "We'll stay here until dusk." They dismounted Mason, wincing at the stiffness in his legs and back. He'd done too much riding too soon after his injury, and his body was making its displeasure known. Still, he forced himself to move normally as he helped Aita unload their supplies, not wanting to give her cause for concern. But she noticed anyway, her dark eyes taking in his careful movements, the way he favored his left side. "The river sickness is growing stronger," she observed as they settled beneath the overhang. "You need to rest." "We both do," Mason deflected, arranging his saddle as a backrest. "It's been a long night." Aita gave him a look that said she wasn't fooled by his evasion, but she didn't press the issue. Instead, she removed a small pouch from her bundle and extracted several dried leaves, crushing them between her fingers. "Chew these," she instructed, offering them to Mason. "They will help with the pain." He hesitated only briefly before accepting them. Whatever reservations he might have about Aita's talk of spirits and visions, he couldn't deny the effectiveness of her herbal remedies. The leaves were bitter, with an astringent quality that made his tongue tingle. But as he chewed, a gentle warmth spread through his body, easing the ache in his side and the tension in his muscles. "Thank you," he said, genuinely grateful. Aita nodded, acknowledgement, then settled cross-legged nearby, her back straight, her hands resting on her knees. Her posture suggested a practiced stillness, a capacity for patience that Mason found himself envying. "You should sleep," he told her. "I'll keep watch for a while." She studied him for a moment, then shook her head. "The herbs will make you drowsy soon. Sleep. I will watch." Mason wanted to argue to insist that he was fine, but even as the thought formed, he felt a pleasant heaviness settling over him. Whatever was in those leaves, it was powerful medicine. "What did you give me?" he asked, his words already slurring slightly. A small smile touched Aita's lips. "Nothing dangerous, healer. Just something to help you rest." Mason meant to respond, to at least negotiate taking turns on watch, but the words never made it past his thoughts. Sleep claimed him with surprising swiftness, pulling him down into darkness. He dreamed again of the Black River, but this time he wasn't alone on its banks. Aita stood beside him, her hand in his, her presence steady and calming. "It's waiting for us both," she said, nodding toward the still water. Across the river, figures moved in the mist. Clara and Sarah as before, but others too. Apache men, women, and children, their faces solemn as they watched from the far shore. "I don't understand," Mason said, his dream voice echoing strangely. "You will," Aita replied, "when it's time." She led him to the water's edge, where the black surface reflected their faces like a mirror. But in the reflection, Mason saw himself not as he was now, but as he had been years ago, younger, without the scar, his eyes unclouded by grief and guilt. "This is who you were," Aita said softly. "This is who you can be again." Mason stared at his reflection, mesmerized by the sight of a self he had thought lost forever. As he watched, ripples disturbed the surface, distorting the image. When it cleared, he saw not himself, but Clara, her face exactly as he remembered it from the day they wed. "She's waiting for you to let her go," Aida said. "They all are." Before Mason could respond, the dream shifted. He was back in the field hospital at Veracruz, surrounded by wounded soldiers. Their faces morphed continuously, American, Mexican, Apache, their injuries growing more severe, more desperate with each passing moment. Mason moved among them, trying to help, but his medical bag was empty. His hands, once so skilled at mending broken bodies, were useless. "I can't save them," he said, panic rising in his throat. "I don't have what I need." "Look again," Aida's voice came from behind him. Mason turned to find her standing there, holding out a small clay pot. Inside was a mixture of herbs and earth, similar to what she had used to treat his fever. "Our medicines are different," she said, "but they serve the same purpose: to heal, to make whole what has been broken." Mason took the pot hesitantly. As his fingers touched the clay, knowledge flowed into him, understanding of plants he'd never seen, techniques he'd never studied, traditions passed down through generations of Apache healers. "This isn't possible," he protested. "In dreams, many things are possible," Aita replied. "In dreams we see what could be, not just what is." She guided his hands as he applied the mixture to a wounded soldier's leg. The man's features settled into those of the young rider Mason had knocked unconscious during their escape. "Even those who mean us harm deserve compassion," Aita said quietly. "This is what makes a true healer." The dream began to fade, the field hospital dissolving into mist. The last thing Mason saw before waking was Clara's face smiling at him with a forgiveness he had never allowed himself to accept. He woke to the sound of a raven's harsh call, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The sun was high, its heat mitigated somewhat by the rock overhang. Beside him, Aita sat in the same cross-legged position as before, her eyes closed, her breathing deep and regular. Mason shifted, wincing at the stiffness in his back. The movement caused Aita's eyes to open immediately, her gaze sharpening as she took in their surroundings. "How long was I asleep?" he asked, his mouth dry. "Most of the day." She handed him a water skin. "You needed it." Mason drank deeply, the cool water reviving him. He was surprised to find that the ache in his side had diminished considerably, though whether from the herbs or simply from rest he couldn't say. "Any sign of pursuit?" he asked, moving to the edge of the overhang to survey the landscape. "None." Aita joined him, her shoulder nearly touching his, as they gazed out over the scrubland they had crossed during the night. "But they will be searching. Blackwood is not a man who forgets or forgives." "No," Mason agreed grimly. "He's not." They stood in silence for a moment, the vastness of the territory before them both reassuring and daunting. Miles of hills and arroyos separated them from Blackwood's men, but also from safety, from the distant mountains where Aita's relatives might provide sanctuary. "I had strange dreams," Mason said, finally turning to look at her, "about a black river, about Clara and you." Aita met his gaze steadily. The river dreams are getting stronger. It's part of the sickness, and you make it sound like a disease. Not a disease, she corrected. A change. The river touched your spirit, Mason Grant. It left something of itself inside you. Mason shook his head, the rational part of his mind rejecting such talk, even as another part, deeper, more intuitive, recognized a truth in her words. These dreams, he said carefully. You have them too. Yes. Aita's expression softened slightly. Since the day the river claimed me and spared me. And what do they mean, these shared visions of black water and the dead watching from the shore? She was quiet for a long moment, considering her answer. My grandmother would say they are messages from the spirit world, guidance for the living. And what would you say? Mason pressed. Aita looked out at the landscape again, her profile sharp against the afternoon light. I would say that some experiences change us in ways we cannot fully understand. The river is one such experience. It wasn't really an answer, but Mason sensed it was all she was prepared to offer. He let the subject drop, turning his attention instead to more immediate concerns. We should eat something before we move on, he suggested. Conserve our strength. They shared a small meal of dried meat and the last of the berries Aita had gathered before their hasty departure from the cave. The food was simple but sustaining, and Mason found his energy returning as he ate. As they prepared to resume their journey, checking the horse and gathering their few possessions, Mason noticed Aita watching him with an unreadable expression. What is it? He asked. You never answered my question, she said. About what happens when we reach the Sierra Blanca. What you will do. Mason sighed, recognizing that she wouldn't be put off a second time. I honestly don't know, Aita. My life before the river, it wasn't much of a life at all. Just existing, working the ranch, keeping to myself, trying not to think about everything I'd lost. And now? Now. He considered the question seriously. Now I'm a fugitive, same as you. Blackwood won't forget that I helped you escape. Going back to my old life isn't an option. That doesn't answer the question. Aita observed her tone gentle but persistent. Mason ran a hand through his hair, frustrated by his own uncertainty. What do you want me to say? That I'll go with you to your people, live as what a white man among Apache. How long before I wear out my welcome? My people are not as quick to judge as yours, she replied evenly. A man who proves himself useful, who shows respect for our ways. Such a man could find a place. The offer for that's what it was, however obliquely stated, caught Mason off guard. He had assumed their paths would diverge once Aita reached safety, that his role in her story was temporary transitional. I'm not looking for a new home, he said finally more harshly than he'd intended. Aita's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes closed off. Of course, I spoke out of turn. She turned away, busying herself with adjusting the horse's bridle. Mason felt a pang of regret at the distance his words had created between them, but he didn't know how to bridge it without making promises he wasn't sure he could keep. They rode out, as dusk settled over the hills, the sky deepening to indigo as the first stars appeared. This time Mason noticed Aita maintained a slight distance between them, on the horse, her hands resting on his shoulders rather than around his waist. The change was subtle but meaningful, a physical manifestation of the emotional space his rejection had created. As they rode, Mason found his thoughts returning to his dream, to the image of himself reflected in the Black River, younger and unburdened by grief. To Clara's face, smiling with forgiveness. To Aita's words, this is who you were. This is who you can be again. Was it possible? Could he reclaim something of the man he had been before loss and guilt had hollowed him out? And if so, what would that man choose to do when they reached the Sierra Blanca? The questions circled in his mind, finding no resolution as the night deepened around them. They rode for 3 nights, following a winding path through increasingly rugged terrain. Each day they found shelter a cave, a dense stand of juniper, once an abandoned line shack that had belonged to a cattle operation long since failed. Each night they pressed on westward, guided by stars and Aita's uncanny sense of direction. The land changed as they traveled, becoming more mountainous, the vegetation shifting from scrub to forest. Water grew more plentiful, small streams feeding down from higher elevations. Game was more abundant too, allowing them to supplement their dwindling supplies with fresh meat when they were fortunate enough to catch something. Throughout the journey, a subtle tension persisted between them. They worked together efficiently, each contributing according to their skills and knowledge. But the easy camaraderie that had begun to develop at the cave had been replaced by a careful politeness. Mason told himself it was for the best. Whatever connection they had formed, whatever binding Aita believed the river had created between them, it was temporary. A product of unusual circumstances, not something that could or should endure beyond their immediate need for mutual survival. Yet he found himself watching her when she wasn't aware the grace of her movements, as she set snares, the concentration in her face, as she dressed, game, the quiet strength that seemed to sustain her through each challenge they faced. And sometimes he caught her watching him with a similar intensity, her dark eyes evaluating him against some standard he couldn't discern. On the 4th night of their journey, they were forced to halt earlier than planned, when a summer storm rolled in from the west, bringing driving rain and spectacular displays of lightning. They took shelter in a shallow cave, the horse tethered just inside the entrance, both of them soaked from the sudden downpour. "We should build a fire," Mason suggested, shivering slightly in his wet clothes. "The rain will hide the smoke." Aita nodded agreement, already gathering what dry material she could find near the cave entrance. Together, they built a small fire, its warmth a welcome relief after the chill of the rain. As they huddled near the flames, Mason found himself studying Aita's profile, illuminated in the flickering light. Her hair, normally bound in a braid, had come loose during their ride, falling in damp waves around her shoulders. Her dress, patched and worn from months of hard use, clung to her frame, emphasizing the strength and resilience of her body. She must have felt his gaze, for she turned to meet it, her expression questioning. "Tell me about your people." Mason said the words emerging before he'd fully formed the thought. "The ones in the Sierra Blanca. What are they like?" Surprise flickered across Aita's face, quickly replaced by thoughtfulness. "They are mescalero," she said after a moment. "Proud, independent. They've resisted the reservation longer than most." "And your aunt, what's she like? Strong, wise?" A small smile touched Aita's lips. "Stubborn. She married a mescalero warrior against my grandfather's wishes, left our band to follow her heart." "She sounds like someone I'd like to meet," Mason said, meaning it. Aita studied him, as if trying to determine his sincerity. "Why are you asking about this now?" Mason hesitated, unsure himself of his motivations. "I suppose I realized I know very little about you, despite everything we've been through together. Where you come from, who your people are. And you want to know these things because they matter to you," he answered simply. "And because—" he broke off, searching for the right words. "Because I haven't been fair to you, Aita. I've been distant, resistant to the idea that what happened at the river might mean something more than a random accident." She watched him steadily, neither encouraging nor discouraging his halting confession. "The truth is," Mason continued. I've spent years hiding from anything that might force me to feel again, to care again. After Clara and Sarah died, I just shut down. It was easier that way. And now, Aita's voice was soft, but intent. Now, I'm not sure what I feel. Mason stared into the fire, finding it easier than meeting her gaze. Except that when you asked what I would do when we reached the Sierra Blanca, and I said I wasn't looking for a new home, that wasn't entirely honest. What would be honest, Mason Grant? He looked up then, meeting her eyes across the flames. That, I'm afraid. Afraid to want anything, to hope for anything, because I've learned how quickly it can all be taken away. Aita nodded slowly, understanding in her expression. Fear is a natural companion after loss. My people have a saying, the wolf of fear follows the trail of grief, but need not share its den. Meaning grief and fear often travel together, but you can acknowledge one without giving permanent shelter to the other. Mason considered this, finding a profound wisdom in the simple analogy. Your people have many sayings, he observed with a small smile. We believe in the power of words, Aita replied, a matching smile softening her features. To teach, to heal, to connect. The rain continued outside, a steady drumming against stone and earth. Inside the cave, something shifted between them, not a complete resolution of the tension that had built over the past days, but a step toward understanding. Would you tell me more? Mason asked. About your people? Your traditions? Aita's smile deepened genuine pleasure, replacing the careful neutrality she had maintained since their conversation under the rock overhang. What would you like to know? They talked long into the night, the storm providing a constant background to their conversation. Aita spoke of her childhood in the mountains north of the Rio Grande, of learning the ways of healing from her grandmother, of the rituals and beliefs that had shaped her understanding of the world. Mason, in turn, shared stories of his own past, his training as a surgeon, his experiences during the war, his brief but happy years with Clara before duty had called him away. He found himself speaking of things he had kept locked inside for years, and with each recollection shared, the weight he carried seemed to lighten slightly. When they finally slept, it was side by side near the fire, the earlier distance between them bridged by words and memories freely given. Mason woke to silence. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a world washed clean, the air sharp with the scent of wet earth and pine. Beside him, Aita still slept, her face peaceful in repose, one hand curled beneath her cheek. He rose carefully, not wanting to disturb her, and moved to the cave entrance. The sky was lightening with approaching dawn, the landscape transformed by the night's storm. Water dripped from leaves and branches, catching the first faint light. It was beautiful, he realized with a start. Truly beautiful, in a way he hadn't allowed himself to notice in years. When had he stopped seeing the world around him? When had mere existence replaced living? A sound behind him made Mason turn. Aita stood watching him, her expression soft with sleep, and something else, something warm, that made his chest tighten with an unfamiliar emotion. "Good morning," he said quietly. "Good morning." She moved to stand beside him, looking out at the rain-washed world. "The storm has passed." "Yes." Mason hesitated, then added, "Thank you for last night, for talking with me, for sharing your stories." Aita glanced up at him, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. It was good to remember the before times, the good memories that came before the sorrows. "Yes," Mason agreed. It was. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching as the light strengthened, defining the contours of the land more clearly. "We should reach the foothills of the Sierra Blanca by tomorrow night," Aida said finally. "Another 2 days beyond that to reach my aunt's band, if they're still in their summer camp." Mason nodded, the reminder of their journey's approaching end stirring a complex mix of emotions. Relief that Aida would soon be safe among her own people. Concern about what reception he, a white man, might receive. And beneath both, a growing certainty that he wasn't ready for their paths to diverge. "Aida," he began, unsure how to express what he was feeling about what happens when we reach your people. She turned to face him fully, her dark eyes intent on his. "Yes." Before Mason could continue, a sound from outside the cave froze them both, the unmistakable jingle of bridal equipment, the soft thud of hooves on damp earth. Riders approaching from the east. Mason reacted instantly, pulling Aida back from the cave entrance, pressing a finger to his lips in a gesture for silence. She nodded, understanding her body tense but controlled. Moving with extreme caution, Mason edged toward the entrance again, staying well within the shadows as he peered out. What he saw made his blood run cold. William Blackwood himself, leading a group of 6 riders, all armed with rifles. They were following the stream that ran near the cave, moving slowly but purposefully, clearly tracking something or someone. Mason pulled back, his mind racing. How had they found their trail? They'd been so careful traveling by night, avoiding established paths. The answer came to him with sickening clarity: the storm. They'd been forced to seek shelter earlier than planned, to travel a more direct route than they might have otherwise. And now Blackwood was less than 100 yards from discovering them. He turned to Aida, who was already moving toward the back of the cave, gathering their few possessions with silent efficiency. The horse thankfully stood quietly, perhaps sensing the danger. Mason joined her, keeping his voice to the barest whisper. "We need to move. Now. Is there another way out?" Aida shook her head. "Just the entrance." Mason thought quickly, assessing their options. They could try to slip away while Blackwood and his men continued along the stream, but the risk of being spotted was high. They could remain hidden and hope the searchers passed by without checking the cave, but if they were discovered, they'd be trapped. Or they could fight an option that Mason knew was virtually suicidal against 7 armed men. "We need a distraction," he decided. "Something to draw them away from here, give us a chance to slip out in the opposite direction." Aida nodded, her expression grim but determined. "The horse," she said softly. "If we send it running east, they will follow, thinking we're fleeing in that direction." It was a good plan, sacrificing their mount for the chance of escape. But it would mean continuing on foot through rough country, significantly slowing their progress toward the Sierra Blanca. "We'd be exposing ourselves," Mason warned. "Visible, vulnerable." "Better than being trapped," Aida countered. "Or separated." The last word caught Mason's attention. "Separated." Aida met his gaze steadily. "They want me, not you. You could surrender, claim I forced you to help me. Blackwood might believe it." "No." Mason's response was immediate and definitive. "That's not an option. We stay together." Something flickered in Aida's eyes, relief perhaps, or confirmation of something she had suspected but needed to hear affirmed. "Together, then," she agreed softly. They moved quickly after that, gathering only what they could carry. Easily, water, food, Aida's small medicine pouch, the knife Mason had taken from the young rider. The rest they would have to abandon. Mason led the horse to the cave entrance, staying carefully within the shadows as he removed the saddle and bridle. The animal seemed to sense his tension, shifting nervously. "Easy," Mason murmured, stroking its neck. "One last service, then you're free." Outside, the voices of Blackwood's men grew louder as they approached, discussing the trail they were following. Mason caught fragments of conversation, something about tracks about the storm washing away signs. He glanced at Aita, who stood ready a few paces back, their small bundle of possessions secured across her back. She nodded once, indicating her readiness. Mason took a deep breath, then delivered a sharp slap to the horse's flank, sending it bolting from the cave. The animal thundered down the slope toward the stream directly into the path of the approaching riders. Shouts of surprise erupted, followed by the pounding of hooves, as Blackwood's men gave chase exactly as Mason had hoped. He waited until the sounds began to recede, then motioned to Aita. "Now," he whispered, "stay low, head west, away from the stream." They slipped from the cave, moving rapidly through the underbrush, using every bit of cover the landscape provided. Mason led the way, choosing their path carefully to minimize visibility while maximizing speed. They had covered perhaps a quarter-mile when a shout behind them announced their discovery. Mason turned to see one of Blackwood's men pointing in their direction from a rise above the cave. "Run!" he urged Aita, abandoning stealth for speed. They fled through the forest, dodging trees and leaping fallen logs, the sounds of pursuit growing louder behind them. Mason's lungs burned his still healing body, protesting the sudden exertion, but fear and determination drove him onward. Aita ran beside him, her movements fluid and sure despite the rough terrain. She seemed to know instinctively which way to turn, which path offered the best chance of escape. The crack of a rifle shot split the air, the bullet splintering bark from a tree just ahead of them. Mason grabbed Aita's arm, pulling her behind a large boulder as a second shot followed the first. "They're trying to pin us down." He gasped, his breath coming in harsh pants. "Slow us until the others catch up." Aita nodded, her own breathing rapid but controlled. She peered around the edge of the boulder, assessing their surroundings. "There," she said, pointing to a steep ravine, perhaps 50 yards ahead. "If we can reach it, we can use it for cover work, our way west." Mason looked where she indicated, noting the difficult approach open ground for at least 20 yards before the protection of the ravine. "It's our best chance," he agreed grimly. "I'll go first, draw their fire. When they're reloading, you run for it." Aita's hand closed around his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. "No, together." Mason started to argue, then saw the determination in her eyes and knew it would be futile. "Together, then," he echoed her earlier words. "On my count. 1, 2, 3. They burst from behind the boulder, running full tilt toward the ravine. Rifle fire erupted behind them, bullets kicking up dirt at their heels. Mason felt rather than saw Aita stumble beside him, but she recovered quickly, never breaking stride. They were halfway to the ravine when Mason heard the thunder of approaching hooves. Blackwood and the rest of his men returning from their pursuit of the horse. They were about to be caught in a crossfire. "Faster!" he urged, though they were already running at the limits of their endurance. The edge of the ravine loomed ahead, a promise of temporary safety if they could just reach it in time. 10 yards. 5. Mason could hear the hoofbeats growing louder, the shouts of the men as they spotted their quarry. 3 yards from the ravine's edge, a bullet struck the ground directly in front of Aita, sending up a spray of dirt and stone. She faltered momentarily, blinded. Mason reacted without thought, sweeping her into his arms and diving forward over the edge of the ravine. They tumbled together down the steep slope, a controlled fall that ended with Mason's back slamming against the ravine floor, Aita on top of him. The impact drove the air from his lungs, but he forced himself to move, rolling them both toward the shelter of an overhanging bank as bullets struck the ground where they had landed. "Are you hit?" he gasped, scanning Aita for signs of injury. She shook her head, already pushing herself up. "We need to keep moving." The ravine leads west, but they'll follow. Mason nodded, struggling to his feet. His ribs screamed in protest, and he suspected he'd re-injured something in the fall. But there was no time to worry about it now. They ran along the ravine floor, using the twists and turns of the natural watercourse to put distance between themselves and their pursuers. Behind them, they could hear Blackwood shouting orders, organizing his men for a more coordinated pursuit. "There's a fork ahead," Aida called over her shoulder. "Left branch leads to higher ground. Right continues west." "Left," Mason decided instantly. "They'll expect us to keep heading west." They took the left branch, climbing steadily upward as the ravine narrowed. The way became steeper, requiring them to use their hands as well as their feet to navigate the rocky terrain. Mason's strength was fading rapidly, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but he forced himself to continue, knowing that to stop was to die. Beside him, Aita moved with the surety of someone born to this landscape, finding handholds and footholds that Mason would have missed. They emerged from the ravine onto a rocky plateau, the forest stretching away before them. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit had grown fainter. Their change of direction had bought them some time, but Mason knew it wouldn't be long before Blackwood's men figured out their strategy. "We need to find somewhere to hole up," he said between labored breaths. "Can't outrun them much longer." Aita scanned the landscape, her gaze sharp, despite their exhausting flight. "There," she said, pointing to a ridge perhaps half a mile distant. "Caves in those rocks, used by my people in the old days." Mason nodded, too winded for speech, and they set off again, moving as quickly as their depleted energy would allow. The plateau gave way to rolling forest, providing cover, but making progress more difficult as they navigated around fallen trees and dense underbrush. By the time they reached the base of the ridge, Mason was operating on pure will. Each breath sent daggers of pain through his chest, and a persistent dizziness threatened his balance. But the prospect of shelter, of a defensible position, drove him onward. The climb was brutal, a near vertical ascent up a rock face, pockmarked with narrow ledges and sparse handholds. Aita went first, finding the path, reaching back more than once to guide Mason's hand to a hold he couldn't see through the sweat stinging his eyes. When they finally reached the cave entrance, Mason collapsed just inside his body, refusing to go any further. Aita knelt beside him, her own breathing rapid, but recovering more quickly than his. "Let me see," she said gently, pulling aside his shirt to examine his ribs. The bruising was extensive, a mottled purple spreading across his left side. Aita's expression grew concerned as she probed gently with her fingers. "Broken," she confirmed. "2, maybe 3 ribs." "Thought so," Mason managed between gritted teeth. "Happened in the fall." Aita moved quickly, retrieving her medicine pouch from the bundle she carried. From it, she withdrew several kinds of dried herbs, mixing them with a small amount of water to create a poultice. "This will help with the pain and swelling," she explained as she applied it to Mason's side. "But you need rest. Real rest." Mason shook his head weakly. "No time. They'll find us, soon enough." "Not here," Aita assured him. "This place is sacred to my people, protected by spirits that white men cannot see." Under normal circumstances, Mason might have dismissed such talk. But after everything they'd been through the river, the dreams, their narrow escape, he found himself wanting to believe her. "Tell me about these spirits," he said, partly to distract himself from the pain, partly because he genuinely wanted to know. Aita secured the poultice with strips torn from the bottom of her dress, her hands gentle but efficient. "My people believe that certain places in the world are thin places, where the boundary between the living world and the spirit world is not as solid. This ridge is one such place. And these spirits, they'll protect us. They will hide us, she corrected. Make us difficult to find, but only if we respect their domain. Mason nodded, too exhausted to argue, too desperate to dismiss any possibility of safety. What do we need to do? Be still. Be quiet. Listen. Aita moved to the cave entrance, peering out at the forest below. I will make an offering when night falls. Mason closed his eyes, surrendering to the exhaustion that pulled at him. The herb poultice was already working a numbing warmth, spreading through his injured side, dulling the sharp edges of the pain. Rest now. Aita's voice came to him as if from a great distance. I will watch. Mason wanted to protest, to insist on taking his share of the vigilance, but his body had reached its limits. Sleep claimed him with the swiftness of a river current, pulling him down into darkness. His last conscious thought was of Aita's face illuminated by firelight as she spoke of her people, her traditions, her beliefs. And with that image came a certainty that had been growing since the moment she'd pulled him from the river. Wherever their journey led, he wanted to face it, at her side. Mason awoke to darkness and the sound of soft chanting. For a moment, he was disoriented, his mind struggling to place his surroundings. Then memory returned in a rush, the chase through the forest, the desperate climb up the ridge, the searing pain in his ribs. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Despite the herbal poultice Aita had applied, his side felt as if it were on fire. He fell back with a muffled groan, breathing shallowly to minimize the movement of his chest. Be still, Aita's voice came from nearby. The binding needs time to work. Mason turned his head carefully, seeking her in the darkness. She sat cross-legged at the cave entrance, silhouetted against the faint glow of twilight. Before her, a small arrangement of objects, stones, feathers, what looked like small bundles of herbs was laid out in a pattern he couldn't discern. What are you doing? He asked, his voice hoarse with thirst and exhaustion. Making an offering to the spirits of this place, she replied without turning. Asking for their protection. Under normal circumstances, Mason might have dismissed such rituals as superstition. But these were not normal circumstances, and he found himself hoping fervently that whatever powers Aita believed in might indeed shield them from Blackwood's relentless pursuit. How long was I asleep? He asked, trying to gauge the passage of time from the quality of light at the cave entrance. Since midday. It's nearly dusk now. Aita finished her chanting and rose fluidly, moving to kneel beside him. How is the pain manageable? Mason lied, not wanting to add to her concerns. She gave him a look that said she wasn't fooled, but didn't press the issue. Instead, she helped him sit up slowly, supporting his back until he was leaning against the cave wall. The change in position made his head swim, but the dizziness passed after a moment. Drink, Aita said, offering a water skin. Slowly. Mason obeyed the cool water, a blessed relief to his parched throat. When he'd had enough, he handed it back, studying her face in the dim light. She looked tired, the strain of their flight showing in the tightness around her eyes, but her movements remained steady and purposeful. Any sign of pursuit? He asked. Aita shook her head. Nothing since we reached the ridge, but they're still searching. I can feel it. Mason nodded, accepting her certainty without question. Whether it was some spiritual awareness, as she believed, or simply the heightened instincts of someone who had spent months being hunted, he trusted her assessment. We need a plan, he said, wincing as a deep breath sent fresh pain through his side. We can't stay here indefinitely. No food, limited water. We have enough for tonight and tomorrow, Aita replied. After that, she trailed off her gaze, turning inward. After that, Mason prompted, She refocused on him, her expression resolute. After that, we must reach the Sierra Blanca. My people will help us there. That's still at least 3 days' journey, Mason pointed out. On foot through rough country with backwoodsmen between us and our destination. 2 days if we travel directly, Aida countered, and the spirits will keep backwoodsmen confused, lead them away from our path. Again, that certainty about things Mason couldn't see or verify. Yet he found himself wanting to believe her, needing to believe that some force beyond their understanding might tip the scales in their favor. "And what about these?" he asked, gesturing to his injured ribs. "I'll slow us down." "You will heal," she said simply. "The medicine I've given you will help. By morning, you'll be able to travel." Mason raised an eyebrow skeptically. "Broken ribs take weeks to heal, Aida, even with your medicine." A small smile touched her lips. "Not all medicine works the same way, Mason Grant. Some mends the body, some strengthens the spirit. You will need both for what lies ahead." There was something in her tone, a gravity, a significance that made Mason study her more closely. "What aren't you telling me?" Aida was silent for a long moment, her dark eyes reflecting the last of the daylight from the cave entrance. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, almost reverent. "The river dreams are getting stronger," she said. "Last night, while you slept at the other cave, I saw what waits for us in the Sierra Blanca." "And what's that?" Mason asked, a chill running through him that had nothing to do with the cooling air. "A choice," she replied enigmatically. "One that will change both our paths forever." Before Mason could press for more details, a sound from outside froze them both, the distant crack of a rifle shot, followed by another. Aida moved silently to the cave entrance, peering out into the gathering darkness. "They're far below," she reported after a tense moment. "Near where we left the ravine, shooting at shadows." Mason exhaled carefully, mindful of his ribs. "Your spirit's at work." "Perhaps," she acknowledged. "Or simple confusion. These hills can play tricks on those who don't know them." She returned to his side, settling cross-legged beside him. In the deepening twilight, her features were becoming indistinct, but Mason could still feel the intensity of her gaze. "You should try to sleep more," she suggested. "The night will be cold, and your body needs rest to heal." "And you?" Mason asked. "When will you rest?" "Soon," she promised. "I need to finish the offering first." Mason wanted to argue, to insist that she rest while he kept watch, but the truth was he doubted his ability to remain alert in his current condition. And Aida had proven time and again that her endurance exceeded what seemed humanly possible. "Wake me in a few hours," he said instead. "I'll take second watch." She nodded agreement, though Mason suspected she had no intention of waking him before dawn. He started to protest, but was interrupted by a sudden wave of exhaustion that seemed to come from nowhere, pulling at his consciousness with irresistible force. "What did you—" he began, suspicion forming as his eyelids grew heavy. "Sleep, Mason." Aida's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Dream of the river. It has more to show you." Darkness claimed him before he could reply. The black river stretched before him, its surface unnaturally still, reflecting the star-filled sky above like a perfect mirror. Mason stood on its bank, aware that he was dreaming, yet unable to wake himself. This time the dream had a different quality, sharper, more immediate, as if he were fully present rather than merely observing. "You're beginning to understand," a voice said from behind him. Mason turned to find Aida standing there, but not as he had last seen her in the cave. This Aida wore a dress of soft buckskin, adorned with intricate beadwork, her hair unbound and flowing around her shoulders. Around her neck hung a small pouch that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. "Is this real?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "As real as the river," she replied. "As real as the choice that waits for us." Mason looked back at the water, noticing for the first time that the far shore was shrouded in mist, concealing whatever or whoever might be waiting there. "Clara," he called, remembering his previous dreams. "Sarah." No answer came, only the soft lapping of the river against the bank. "They're not here," Aida said gently. "Not yet. This dream is different." "Different how?" She moved to stand beside him, her presence warm and solid despite the dreamlike quality of their surroundings. "This is a dream of what may be not what was." As she spoke, the mist on the far shore began to thin, revealing indistinct figures moving within it. Mason strained to see them clearly, but they remained just beyond the threshold of recognition. "Who are they?" he asked. "Possibilities," Aida answered. "Lives that might be lived if we choose them." Before Mason could ask what she meant, the river before them began to change. Its surface rippled, then parted, revealing a path of smooth stones leading across the water. "We can cross?" Mason asked, surprised. In his previous dreams, the river had always been an impassable barrier, a division between the living and the dead. "If we choose to," Aida confirmed. "But once crossed, there's no returning to the shore we left behind." Mason studied the stone path dubiously. "And if we stay on this side, then we remain as we are. You a man haunted by guilt and loss, me the last of my band forever hunted." Put that way, crossing seemed the obvious choice. Yet something held Mason back, a deep-seated fear of the unknown, of surrendering the familiar pain that had defined him for so long. "What's on the other side?" he asked. Aida smiled, a gentle expression that transformed her face. "That depends on what we're brave enough to become." She held out her hand, an invitation rather than a demand. Mason hesitated, then took it, her fingers warm and strong against his. Together they stepped onto the first stone. It held firm beneath their weight, solid, despite being surrounded by the dark water. One by one they moved across the river, each step bringing the figures on the far shore into clearer focus. Halfway across, Mason stopped abruptly, recognition dawning. "That's us." Indeed, among the figures in the mist he could now make out himself and Aida, but changed in subtle ways. His dream self stood straighter, the scar on his face less prominent, his eyes clear of the shadows that had haunted them for years. Beside him, Aida appeared as she did now, but with an air of peace about her that the real Aida had never possessed in his presence. And there were others, children of various ages, some clearly Apache, others of mixed heritage. They moved around the dream Mason and dream Aida with the easy familiarity of family. "This is a possible future," Aida explained, watching his reaction carefully. "One of many." Mason stared at the scene, emotions warring within him, longing, disbelief, fear. "With the mescalero in the Sierra Blanca, for a time," she said, "until the world changes again, as it always does." The vision shifted, showing the same group, but older in a different setting, a small homestead in a valley, part farm, part traditional Apache camp. Mason saw himself teaching a young boy to set a broken limb using both modern medical techniques and the herbal remedies he had learned from Aida. "A healer again," he murmured, understanding dawning. "Both of us," Aida agreed, "bridging two worlds, two traditions." The vision changed once more, showing them older still. Gray streaked Mason's hair and lines of experience marked Aida's face, but both moved with the vigorous purpose of those who know their value in the world. "Is this what you saw, Ruth?" Mason asked. In your dream at the other cave, part of it, she acknowledged. But there are other possibilities too. Darker ones. As if summoned by her words, the vision before them wavered, then reformed into something very different. Mason saw himself alone, older, but bent with grief rather than age, living in squalid isolation. In this vision, there was no sign of Aita. "What happened to you?" he asked, his chest tight with sudden dread. "In this future I died," she said simply. "Killed by Blackwood's men when we tried to reach the Sierra Blanca." The vision shifted again, showing another possibility. Aita alive, but Mason gone, she living among her people, but with a profound sadness in her eyes, a solitude that no tribal community could breach. "And in this one, you died," she continued, "sacrificing yourself so I could escape." Mason felt sick. Are these the only choices? One of us dies, so the other can live. No. Aita squeezed his hand reassuringly. There is another way, but it requires something from both of us that neither has been willing to give. What? Complete trust, she said, meeting his gaze steadily. In each other, in the river, in what it's trying to show us. Mason looked down at the dark water flowing around the stone path. I don't understand what the river wants from me. It doesn't want anything, Aita corrected gently. It simply is, a boundary between what was and what could be, between holding on and letting go. Letting go of what? Your guilt, she said softly. Your need to punish yourself for Clara and Sarah's deaths. Your belief that you don't deserve happiness because you weren't there when they needed you. The words struck Mason like a physical blow. For years he had carried that guilt, that self-condemnation, wearing it like armor against the possibility of caring again, of risking again. And you, he asked, his voice rough with emotion. What do you need to let go of? Aita's expression grew solemn. My hatred. My desire for revenge against men like Blackwood. My belief that I am the last guardian of my people's memory, that I alone must carry their stories. Mason looked back at the vision of them together, teaching healing building something that bridged their separate worlds. Could such a future really be possible? Or was it just a dream, a fantasy born of their desperate circumstances? How do we know which future is real? He asked. Which one waits for us if we cross the river? We don't, Aita admitted. We can only choose which one we will try to create. Before Mason could respond, a sound intruded on the dream, distant but growing louder. The baying of hounds. Blackwood, Aita said, her expression turning urgent. He's found a new way to track us. The dream began to dissolve around them, the river, the stone path, the visions on the far shore, all fading like mist in morning sunlight. Remember what you've seen. Aita's voice came to him as if from a great distance. Remember the choice. Mason woke with a gasp, his heart pounding. The cave was dark, except for a faint glow from the embers of a small fire Aita must have built while he slept. Outside, the sound that had intruded on his dream continued, the baying of tracking hounds, still distant but unmistakable. Aita was already awake, gathering their few possessions with swift economical movements. She glanced at him as he struggled to sit up. They've brought dogs, she said, her voice tight with controlled fear. We need to move, now. Mason forced himself to his feet, grimacing at the pain in his side. To his surprise, it was less severe than he had expected, still present, but dulled enough that he could move with reasonable freedom. Your medicine worked, he observed, testing his range of motion carefully. Enough for what we need to do. Aita agreed, handing him the water skin. "Drink, we have a hard journey ahead." Mason drank deeply, his mind still filled with images from the dream, the river, the stone path, the visions of possible futures. It had felt so real, so immediate, that he found himself struggling to refocus on their present danger. "Aita," he began, not sure how to ask if she had shared the dream, if she had seen what he had seen. She paused in her preparations, meeting his gaze in the dim light. "I know," she said simply, "but there's no time now. We must reach the Sierra Blanca before Blackwood catches us." Mason nodded, understanding the urgency. Questions about dreams and visions would have to wait. Survival came first. They slipped out of the cave into the pre-dawn darkness, the eastern sky just beginning to lighten with the promise of approaching day. The air was cool and still, carrying the distant sounds of Blackwood's hunting party, men's voices, horses' hooves, the eager baying of the hounds. "This way," Aita whispered, leading Mason along a narrow path that wound down the backside of the ridge away from their pursuers. "There's a stream at the bottom. We can use it to hide our scent from the dogs." They descended as quickly as Mason's injury allowed, using the rough terrain for cover. Aita moved with the sure-footed confidence of someone born to the wilderness, finding handholds and footholds that Mason would have missed without her guidance. By the time they reached the stream, the sky had lightened enough to see their surroundings clearly. It was a small watercourse no more than a few feet across, but it ran swift and clear over a rocky bed. "We'll follow it downstream," Aita decided, stepping into the cold water without hesitation. "The current will wash away our tracks, and the dogs will lose our scent." Mason followed her example, wincing as the icy water numbed his feet. They moved carefully along the streambed, using the rocky banks for support, where necessary keeping their bodies low to minimize their silhouette against the brightening sky. For what seemed like hours, they followed the stream's winding course, stopping occasionally to listen for signs of pursuit. The baying of the hounds grew fainter, then ceased altogether, suggesting their strategy was working for now. As the sun climbed higher, the day grew warmer, but the stream water remained bitingly cold. Mason's feet and legs had long since gone numb, and he could see that Aita, despite her stoicism, was also suffering from the prolonged immersion. "We need to get out of the water soon," he said when they paused to rest on a flat rock midstream. "Hypothermia is a real risk, especially if we're already weakened." Aita nodded, scanning the terrain ahead. "There," she pointed to where the stream entered a densely wooded area. "We can leave the water there, use the forest for cover." They pushed on their movements, growing more labored, as fatigue and cold took their toll. When they finally reached the wooded area and climbed out onto the bank, Mason had to help Aita stand, her legs stiff and unresponsive from the cold. "We need to get warm," he said, noting with concern the bluish tinge to her lips. "Find a sheltered spot. Try to dry out." She nodded, leaning against him more heavily than he suspected she intended. Together, they made their way deeper into the forest, seeking a place where they could rest without being easily spotted. They found it in a small clearing surrounded by dense pine, where fallen logs created a natural windbreak. The ground was carpeted with pine needles, soft and relatively dry. Mason helped Aita sit, then set about gathering dry twigs and branches for a small fire. "Is it safe?" she asked, watching him work. "The smoke." "Small risk," Mason decided. "We're far enough from where we left the stream that they won't connect it to us immediately, and we need the warmth more than we need perfect concealment right now." Using techniques Aita had taught him during their time at the cave, Mason managed to start a small, nearly smokeless fire. They huddled close to it, removing their soaked moccasins and holding their feet toward the flames. As warmth gradually returned to their bodies, Mason studied Aita's face in the daylight. She looked exhausted, the strain of their flight etched in the shadows beneath her eyes, the tightness around her mouth. Yet there was still that core of indomitable strength about her, a refusal to surrender that he had come to admire deeply. "We should reach the foothills of the Sierra Blanca by nightfall," she said, tracking his thoughts with uncanny precision. "If we keep moving once we're warm." Mason nodded, though he wondered if either of them had the strength for another full day's journey. His ribs, while better than they had been, still ached persistently, and the cold water had done them no favors. "And your people?" he asked. "How will we find them once we reach the mountains?" "There are signs," Aita explained. "Markers left for those who know how to read them. My aunt's band moves with the seasons, but they follow patterns traditions. And if Blackwood follows us there," Aita's expression hardened, "then he will face more than just the two of us. My people know how to defend themselves." Mason didn't doubt it, but he also knew the ruthlessness of men like Blackwood, their willingness to bring overwhelming force against native populations they considered inferior. "We need to lose him before we lead him to your people," Mason said decisively. "End this here in the foothills, one way or another." Aita looked at him sharply. "What are you suggesting?" "A trap?" Mason replied, the plan forming as he spoke. "Use his obsession with capturing you against him. Make him careless." "That's too dangerous," she protested. "You're injured. We're both exhausted, and Blackwood has men weapons dogs." "But we have something he doesn't," Mason countered. "Knowledge of what's coming." Aita's eyes widened slightly as she caught his meaning. "The river dreams," Mason nodded. "In my dream last night, I saw possibilities, futures that might be depending on the choices we make. In one of them, Blackwood caught up to us before we reached the Sierra Blanca." "And," Aita prompted when he hesitated, "and in that future one of us died," he said simply. "I don't intend to let that happen." "So instead you want to set a trap for 7 armed men and their dogs." Aita's tone was skeptical, but Mason could see she was considering the idea. "Not exactly," he clarified. "I want to separate Blackwood from his men. Deal with him alone." "How?" Mason smiled grimly. "By giving him exactly what he wants, a clear shot at capturing you." They moved again once they were sufficiently warm, keeping to the densest parts of the forest, where the pine canopy would hide them from any observers on the ridges above. Mason's plan, refined through discussion with Aita, was simple but risky. It depended on timing, on Blackwood's predictable obsession, and on a deep understanding of the terrain they were traversing. By midday, they had covered several miles the wooded foothills of the Sierra Blanca, rising before them. The land grew steeper, more broken, offering both challenges and opportunities for what they intended. There, Aita pointed to a narrow canyon cutting through the first line of hills. "That's the most direct route into the mountains. Blackwood will expect us to take it." "And will he be right?" Mason asked, studying the terrain with a tactician's eye. "No," she replied with a small smile. "There's another way known only to my people. A hidden path through the rocks. But we need Blackwood to think we're taking the canyon." Mason nodded understanding. "We leave a trail for him to follow obvious enough that he won't question it." "Exactly," Aita confirmed. "And then we set our trap where the canyon narrows just before it opens into the valley beyond." They continued toward the canyon, deliberately leaving signs of their passage, now broken branches, disturbed ground, even a piece of cloth torn from Aita's dress caught on a thorny bush. Enough to convince Blackwood they were growing desperate, careless in their haste to reach the mountains. As they neared the canyon entrance, Mason's anticipation grew. This was the most dangerous part of their plan. They needed to be seen to confirm for Blackwood that his prey was within reach, but not be caught, before they could spring their trap. "There," Aita said suddenly, pointing to a ridge across the valley. "Riders!" Mason followed her gaze and saw them 4 horsemen silhouetted against the sky, clearly visible as they moved along the ridgeline. Even at this distance, he recognized the lead figure, William Blackwood, his distinctive broad-brimmed hat and upright bearing, unmistakable. "They've spotted us," Mason said with grim satisfaction, as the riders suddenly changed direction, spurring their horses toward the valley floor. "Now we run!" They sprinted for the canyon entrance, making no attempt at concealment now. Behind them, they could hear shouts, the pounding of hooves, as Blackwood and his men gave chase. The canyon was just as Aita had described, narrow with steep walls, rising on either side, the floor strewn with boulders and scrub brush. They ran along it, Mason ignoring the protest from his injured ribs, Aita matching her pace to his, despite her ability to move faster. "Almost there," she gasped as they rounded a bend in the canyon. "The Narrows are just ahead." Mason glanced back. No sign of their pursuers yet, but the sounds of approach were growing louder. "They're closing in. We need to hurry." They pushed on the canyon walls, drawing closer together, until they were running through a passage barely wide enough for 2 people to walk abreast. Ahead, Mason could see where the canyon widened again before opening into the valley beyond. "Here," Aita said, stopping abruptly beside a narrow crevice in the canyon wall. "This is the hidden path." Mason looked dubiously at the opening. It was small, easily overlooked if you didn't know it was there. "That leads to the mountains." "Eventually," she confirmed. "But first, we set the trap." Working quickly, they gathered loose rocks and dead branches, piling them strategically along the top of the narrow passage. When the pile was complete, Aita pointed to a projecting ledge about 10 feet up the canyon wall. "From there, we can trigger the rock fall when Blackwood passes beneath," she explained. Mason nodded, seeing the logic of it. "You climb up first, I'll follow." Aita scaled the wall with practiced ease, finding handholds in the seemingly smooth rock face. Mason followed more slowly, his injured ribs limiting his mobility, but eventually joined her on the narrow ledge. They had barely settled into position when the first of their pursuers appeared at the bend in the canyon. It was one of Blackwood's men, a young tracker leading the dogs on a long leash. The animals strained forward, eager to catch the scent of their quarry. "Hold," Mason whispered, placing a restraining hand on Aita's arm. "Wait for Blackwood." They watched as the tracker passed directly beneath their position, followed by 2 more of Blackwood's men rifles at the ready. Finally, Blackwood himself appeared, moving with the confidence of a predator who knows his prey is cornered. "Now!" Mason hissed. Together, they pushed at the carefully balanced pile of rocks and branches they had assembled. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groaning sound that quickly built to a rumble, the rockfall began. Stones and debris cascaded down into the narrow passage, creating an instant barrier between Blackwood and his men. The dogs yelped in panic, dragging their handler forward, away from the falling rocks. The 2 riflemen scrambled after them, leaving Blackwood isolated on the near side of the rockfall. Mason and Aita didn't wait to see more. They scrambled back down the canyon wall on the Blackwood side of the barrier, positioning themselves to block his retreat. Blackwood whirled at the sound of their descent, his hand going to the pistol at his belt. But Mason was quicker, having anticipated the move. He tackled the older man before he could draw, driving him to the ground with enough force to knock the wind from his lungs. "It's over, Blackwood," Mason growled, pinning the man's arms. "Your men can't help you now." Blackwood struggled, his face contorted with rage and disbelief. "Grant, what the hell are you doing? Let me go, man. That Apache witch has addled your brain." "No," Mason replied calmly. For the first time in years, I'm seeing clearly." Aita approached, standing over them, with the quiet dignity Mason had come to associate with her. She carried no weapon yet. Blackwood flinched away from her as if she were the most dangerous thing he had ever encountered. "You killed my people," she said, her voice level but charged with emotion. "Children, elders, those who had done you no harm. They were Apache," Blackwood spat. "Savages, thieves who took my boy." "Your son wasn't taken," Mason said, remembering what he'd heard about the young man's disappearance. "He ran away. Everyone in the territory knows it. He couldn't stomach your cruelty anymore." Deep. Blackwood bucked beneath Mason's weight, nearly dislodging him. "He was stolen, murdered." "No," Aita said with quiet certainty. "He lives. I have seen him in my dreams in a place far to the west. He has found peace, William Blackwood. Something you never allowed him." Blackwood stilled his expression, shifting from rage to a complex mix of disbelief and desperate hope. "How could you know that? How could you possibly know anything about my son?" "The river shows me many things," Aita replied. "Past, present, future. Those who are lost and those who wish to be found." A strange silence fell over the canyon. Mason maintained his hold on Blackwood, but he could feel the fight draining out of the older man, replaced by a confusion that bordered on despair. "What do you want?" Blackwood asked finally. "Revenge. Go ahead and kill me then. Get it over with." Aita shook her head. "Death is easy, William Blackwood. Living with what you've done, that is the harder path." She knelt beside him, her movements deliberate and unhurried. From the small medicine pouch at her waist, she withdrew a pinch of some powdery substance, then leaned forward and blew it directly into Blackwood's face. The effect was immediate. His eyes rolled back, his body went limp beneath Mason's grip, and his breathing slowed to the deep rhythm of profound sleep. "What did you do?" Mason asked, releasing his hold on the unconscious man. "Gave him dreams," Aita replied, rising to her feet. "Dreams of truth, of his son alive but far away, of the people he has killed, their faces, their names. Dreams he cannot escape until he has faced them all." Mason stared at her, a mixture of awe and unease washing through him. "Will he recover?" "Eventually," she said. "Changed, I hope. But that is up to him and the spirits who guide his dreams." She turned toward the crevice in the canyon wall, the hidden path she had mentioned earlier. "We should go. His men will find a way around the rockfall soon enough." Mason hesitated, looking down at Blackwood's unconscious form. "We're just leaving him here. His men will find him," Aita assured him. "His body will survive. His spirit, that depends on what he chooses to see in the dreams." Something in her tone made Mason look at her sharply. "You've done this before." A small, sad smile touched her lips. "Once to myself after the massacre, when the grief was too much to bear waking." The revelation stunned Mason. "You put yourself into a dream state for how long?" 3 days, she replied. "Long enough to see what the river wanted to show me. To understand that my path wasn't finished, that I had purpose still." Mason shook his head, both amazed and disturbed by this glimpse into Aita's past. "And that purpose led you to me." "Among other things," she acknowledged. "Come, we have far to go before nightfall." She led the way to the crevice, slipping into it with practiced ease. Mason followed, casting one last glance at Blackwood's still form before the shadows of the narrow passage enveloped him. The hidden path was more challenging than Mason had anticipated, a winding route through tight passages up steep inclines and across narrow ledges with dizzying drops below. Without Aita's guidance, he would have been hopelessly lost within minutes. They emerged hours later onto a high ridge overlooking a valley nestled among the foothills of the Sierra Blanca. The sun was low in the western sky, casting long shadows across the landscape. From this vantage point, Mason could see for miles back toward the plains they had crossed ahead, to the mountains, rising majestically against the horizon. "We're safe for now," Aita said, surveying the terrain with the eye of someone who had been raised to read the land like a book. "Blackwood's men will search the canyon for hours before they think to look elsewhere." Mason nodded, too exhausted for speech. The day's exertions had taken their toll on his still healing body. His ribs ached fiercely, and a bone-deep weariness had settled into his limbs. Aita noticed his condition and led him to a sheltered spot beneath an overhanging rock. "Rest," she instructed. "I'll find water." She disappeared into the sparse pine forest that covered the ridge, moving with the silent efficiency that still amazed Mason after all they had been through together. He sank down gratefully, leaning back against the cool stone and closing his eyes. Despite his exhaustion, sleep eluded him. His mind was too full of the confrontation with Blackwood, of Aita's strange power over dreams, of the visions he had seen in his own dream of the river, and the possible futures that awaited them. When Aita returned carrying a water skin she had somehow managed to fill, Mason accepted it gratefully. The water was cold and sweet, easing his parched throat. "We'll reach my people tomorrow," she said, settling beside him. "If we start at first light and travel steadily." Mason nodded, returning the water skin. And then, it was the question that had hung between them since his dream. What came after, what future they would choose from the possibilities the river had shown them. Aita was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "That depends," she said finally, "on what you want, Mason Grant." "What I want?" He repeated the words, feeling strange in his mouth. How long had it been since he had allowed himself to want anything beyond mere survival, beyond the numbing routine that had defined his existence since Clara and Sarah's deaths? "In my dream," he began hesitantly, "I saw us together, teaching healing, building something new." Aita turned to look at him, her expression carefully neutral. "I saw the same. But dreams, even river dreams, are not commands. They are possibilities, paths that may be taken or refused." "And if I choose that path?" Mason asked, his heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with their recent exertions. "If I want to build that future with you?" A warmth kindled in Aita's dark eyes, though her voice remained measured. "Then we would have much work ahead of us. My people will not easily accept a white man, even one who has helped me. And the world beyond these mountains is changing in ways that threaten all native peoples." "I know," Mason acknowledged. "It won't be easy, but I've spent years taking the easy path, isolating myself, nursing my guilt, refusing to engage with life. I don't want that anymore." He reached out hesitantly, taking her hand in his. Her skin was warm, calloused from hard work, strong. "The river showed me that I have a choice to remain trapped in the past, or to build something new. I choose the new path, Aita, if you'll walk it with me." For a long moment, she was silent, her eyes searching his face, as if looking for any sign of doubt or insincerity. Then slowly she smiled, a full, genuine smile that transformed her features and stirred something in Mason's chest that he had thought long dead. "The women in my family have always been dreamers," she said softly. "We see what others cannot. But even we cannot see all paths, all possibilities." She squeezed his hand gently. I choose to walk this new path with you, Mason Grant, to see what we might build together." The simple declaration filled Mason with a quiet joy, a sense of rightness that he hadn't experienced in years. He didn't try to kiss her; that would come in its own time, when they had both healed more fully from their respective wounds. Instead, he simply held her hand as they watched the sun sink toward the horizon, painting the Sierra Blanca in hues of gold and rose. "We should sleep," Aida said eventually. "Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." They arranged their meager possessions to create a sort of nest against the rock, sharing body heat against the cooling night air. Aida curled against Mason's side, careful of his injured ribs, her head resting on his shoulder. As darkness claimed the land, and stars began to appear overhead, Mason found himself thinking of Clara and Sarah. For the first time in years, the memory brought a bittersweet ache rather than crushing guilt. He imagined them at peace, free of suffering, perhaps watching over him as Aida's people believed their ancestors did. "Good night, my loves," he whispered to the stars. "I'm letting go now. Not of you, never of you, but of the guilt, of the pain. It's time." Beside him, Aida stirred slightly, as if hearing his unspoken thoughts. "They know," she murmured sleepily. "The river has told them." Mason smiled in the darkness, no longer questioning her certainty about such things. If the past weeks had taught him anything, it was that there were more mysteries in the world than his medical training had prepared him for, more ways of knowing than pure rationality could explain. With that thought, he drifted into sleep, not the black unconsciousness of exhaustion or the vivid unreality of the river dreams, but a natural healing rest. For the first time since he had been pulled from the river, Mason slept without dreaming at all. Dawn found them already moving, following a winding path down from the ridge into the valley below. Aida led the way occasionally, pausing to examine subtle markings on trees or rocks, signs left by her people that were invisible to Mason's untrained eye. "We're close," she announced, as they crossed a small stream around midday. "The summer camp should be just beyond that line of hills." Mason nodded, fighting down a sudden nervousness. How would Aida's people receive him? A white man, former military surgeon, someone who had stood by while other white men massacred an Apache band. He wouldn't blame them if they rejected him outright. Aida seemed to sense his apprehension. "My aunt is wise," she said. "She will listen before she judges. And you saved my life, Mason. That counts for much among my people." "I hope so," he replied, not entirely reassured. They crested the final hill just as the sun reached its zenith. Below them, nestled in a protected valley with a clear stream running through it, lay an Apache encampment. It was smaller than Mason had expected, perhaps 20 wickiups arranged in a rough circle, with horses grazing in a meadow nearby. Aida stopped surveying the scene with visible emotion. "They're here," she whispered, "just as the dreams showed." Mason stood beside her, taking in the peaceful scene. Children played near the stream, women worked outside the dwellings, men tended to horses or sat in councils. It was a glimpse into a way of life that was increasingly under threat from people like Blackwood people who saw native tribes as obstacles to be removed, rather than cultures to be respected. "How do we approach?" he asked. "Openly," Aida replied. "No sneaking, no hiding. They will have sentries watching the hills. They've already seen us." Indeed, as Mason looked more carefully, he noticed several mounted figures moving from the camp toward the base of the hill, warriors coming to investigate the strangers on their boundary. They descended slowly, making no sudden movements. Aida walked slightly ahead, her posture straight and proud, despite the exhaustion of their journey. Mason followed a pace behind, his hands clearly visible, his face composed into what he hoped was a respectful but confident expression. The warriors met them at the foot of the hill, 4 men on horseback, armed with rifles as well as traditional weapons. They regarded Aita with surprise that quickly shifted to recognition. "I am Aita, daughter of Taluta, niece of Kiona," she announced in clear, carrying tones. "I seek shelter with my mother's sister and her people." One of the warriors, an older man with streaks of gray in his long hair, studied her intently. "Aita of the Eastern Band. We heard all were killed at Crow Creek." "What all?" she replied simply. "I survived, and I have journeyed far to reach you." The warrior's gaze shifted to Mason, his expression hardening. "You bring a white man to our camp." "I bring a healer," Aita corrected, "a man who saved my life and fought beside me against those who would have killed me. He comes under my protection and seeks no harm to our people." The warriors conferred briefly in their language, which Mason couldn't understand. Finally, the older one nodded. "You may enter our camp and speak with the elders," he decided. "The white man may come also, but he will be watched." "Thank you," Aita replied with dignity. "We ask for nothing more." They were escorted into the camp, the arrival of a survivor from a massacred band and her white companion drawing considerable attention. Children stared openly. Women paused in their tasks to watch men gathered in small groups speaking in low voices. Mason felt the weight of their collective gaze like a physical pressure. He kept his eyes respectfully lowered, following Aita's lead in all things, acutely aware that he was an intruder in a world where few white men were welcomed. They were brought to a larger wickiup near the center of the camp. Outside it sat an older woman, her silver-streaked hair bound in the same style as Aita's, her face lined with experience, but her back straight, her hands steady as they worked on a piece of beadwork. She looked up as they approached, her expression shifting from curiosity to shock to joy in the space of heartbeats. "Aita," she breathed, rising to her feet with a grace that belied her years. "Child of my sister, can it be?" Aita stepped forward, emotion clearly visible on her face. "Aunt Kiona, I have found you at last." The older woman embraced Aita fiercely, holding her as if afraid she might disappear. They spoke rapidly in Apache, too quick for Mason to follow, even if he had understood the language. He stood awkwardly to one side, giving them the privacy of their reunion. After several minutes, Kiona released Aita and turned her attention to Mason. Her dark eyes, so similar to her niece's, assessed him with penetrating intelligence. "So," she said, in accented but clear English, "you are the white healer who saved my niece." Mason bowed his head slightly in acknowledgement. "Mason Grant, ma'am. But it was Aita who saved me first, pulled me from the river when I was drowning." A small smile touched Kiona's lips. "The river, of course." She glanced at Aita. "You have had the dreams," Aita nodded. "Both of us. The river has shown us many things." Kiona considered this, then gestured toward her dwelling. "Come, both of you. We have much to discuss, and you look in need of rest and food." The interior of the wickiup was cool and dim, decorated with woven blankets and items of spiritual significance that Mason couldn't identify. Kiona served them a simple meal of dried meat corn cakes and wild berries, watching as they ate with the hunger of those who have traveled hard on minimal provisions. When they had finished, she filled and lit a small pipe, taking a ceremonial puff before passing it to Aita. "Now," she said, "tell me everything." And so they did, taking turns to recount the events since Crow Creek, Aita's solitary survival, Mason's near drowning, their time at the cave, the pursuit by Blackwood, their escape through the hidden canyon, and finally the river dreams that had shown them possible futures. Kiona listened without interruption, her expression thoughtful. When they had finished, she sat in silence for several minutes as if digesting all she had heard. "The river has bound you," she said finally. "This is rare, but not unknown among our people. When two souls are joined by the water that flows between worlds, it is a powerful thing." She turned her penetrating gaze on Mason. "What do you seek here, healer? Among a people who have every reason to mistrust your kind." It was the question Mason had been dreading. Yet now that it was asked directly, he found the answer came easily. "A place to heal," he said honestly, "and to help others heal using both my medical knowledge and what Aita has taught me of your ways. I seek a purpose beyond my own pain, a chance to build rather than destroy. And you believe you will find this among the Apache?" Kiona's tone was skeptical, but not dismissive. "When your people hunt us like animals, force us onto reservations, destroy our way of life." "Not all white men are the same," Mason replied, meeting her gaze steadily. "Just as not all Apache are the same. I can't change what others of my race have done or will do. I can only choose my own path." "And what of Aita?" Kiona asked. "What is she to you in this path you choose?" Mason glanced at Aita, who watched him with an expression that gave nothing away. "She is," he began, then paused, searching for the right words. "She is the one who showed me that life still has meaning, that the past need not define the future. She is my teacher, my friend, and if she chooses my partner, in whatever we build together." A long silence followed his declaration. Kiona studied him intently, as if trying to see beyond his words to the truth of his heart. "The dreaming women in our family," she said at last, turning to Aita, "have always walked difficult paths. Paths between worlds, between ways of knowing. It seems you are no exception, my niece." She sighed, a sound of resignation tinged with acceptance. "The elders will need to be consulted. There will be those who object to a white man living among us no matter his intentions. But for now, you are both welcome in my dwelling. Rest. Heal. The decisions will come soon enough." She rose, gathering the remnants of their meal. "I must inform the council of your arrival. Stay here until I return." When Kiona had gone, Mason turned to Aita. "Will they accept me?" She considered the question carefully. "Some will, some won't. But my aunt's voice carries weight, and the fact that I've had the river dreams will matter to many of the elders." "And if they refuse?" It was a possibility Mason had to consider. "What then?" Aita's hand found his, her fingers intertwining with his own. "Then we find another way, another place. The river showed us many possibilities. Remember." Mason nodded, drawing strength from her touch, her certainty. "Together," he said, "whatever comes next." "Together," she agreed softly. Outside the wickiup, they could hear the sounds of the camp children laughing, women talking, men discussing the arrival of strangers. Life continuing, adapting, finding a way forward, just as they were trying to do. Mason felt a profound sense of peace settle over him, deeper than anything he had experienced since before Clara and Sarah's deaths. Whatever the council decided, whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew he was finally on the right path, the one the river had been trying to show him all along. Aita leaned against him gently, mindful of his healing ribs, her head resting on his shoulder. Together, they waited for Kiona's return, for the decision that would shape their immediate future, for the next step in the journey that had begun when Aita pulled him from the swollen river on that fateful spring day. The river had claimed them both in different ways. And now it had brought them to this moment of possibility, this threshold between what was and what could be. Mason closed his eyes, feeling the steady rhythm of Aita's breathing beside him, and made his final peace with the past. Clara and Sarah would always be part of him, carried in his heart, rather than as burdens of guilt on his shoulders. Aita's people massacred at Crow Creek would be honored through her survival, through the traditions she would preserve and pass on. And together, perhaps they could build something new, a bridge between worlds, a healing place for bodies and spirits alike. Not an ending, but a beginning. Outside, a raven called 3 times, its harsh cry echoing across the valley. Then it took flight, a black shadow against the endless blue of the New Mexico sky, leaving no trace of its passing, save the promise of what was to come.